Hi, we are Eva, Joe, and Sean from the University of Edinburgh. UK 2029 envisions a future for the United Kingdom in which citizen scientists find themselves empowered by DIY biology to tackle very local issues they face and to protest the injustices they perceive in society.
Earlier this year, the United Kingdom began the formal procedure of leaving the European Union. This is obviously a very emotive topic within the UK, with lots of strong emotions on either side of the divide. But for us, what we found really interesting is one aspect of the legislative shift that is going to have to happen. The United Kingdom currently operates under the EU legislation regarding genetic modification, which are incredibly restrictive when it comes to the deployment of GMOs outside of the lab environment. Due to these restrictions, only a handful of GMOs, all of which are crops, are currently authorised for use in the outside world in Europe. This means in 2 years' time, the UK will be in a position to write its own legislation regarding genetic modifications and the novel organisms that result from it. The opportunities this presents for speculation are vast, and depending on the route that this legislation takes, the UK that emerges 10 years after Brexit could look radically different from the one that we know today. Is it?
In questioning how the biotechnological landscapes of both the UK and the US will grow over the course of the coming decade, we became interested in several different reports that project their own future visions. So there's the US report, Preparing for Future Products of Biotechnologies, which recognizes, interestingly, the significant contributions of DIY biologists within this emerging industry. It discusses peer-to-peer sharing repositories, empowering people to build upon shared designs, and businesses drawing innovation from their customer base. What's also interesting is how the creations that these DIY biologists are making are referred to. The report speculates on people creating private solutions that they begin to share with themselves, their friends, and their families. They may or may not choose to distribute, sell, or patent these things. This is similar to the way that other emerging technologies often challenge our ideas of what a product is to become something that is more fluid in its definition. Hence, these DIY creations are anticipated to challenge legislation and risk assessments. This speculation is in stark contrast to the two papers from the UK that we were looking at. They focus more upon building an innovation culture in which the government is entirely serving the interests of industry and academia through attempting to do better in capitalizing upon our own research innovations. Little, if anything, is said about the interests of DIY biologists within this culture and how they might begin to contribute. We focused on this disproportionately represented space, exploring the interests of DIY biologists and how they may extend beyond the strictly commercial and environmental challenges towards addressing social and political concerns that affect them. There are currently around 100 DIY biolabs throughout the world. So similar to GenSpace in New York, many of the UK labs were made through donated equipment and run by enthusiasts. So within our city of Edinburgh, we have our own DIY lab. It's called ASCUS, the Art and Science Lab, and it's pictured here. And well, lots of the equipment is in fact donated from companies that have folded. So we believe that within a UK in which this industry is growing through startups within a competitive entrepreneurial ecosystem, the capabilities of our DIY labs will grow too upon the fallout from commercial innovations. Their licenses equally may allow them to do more things as legislation becomes more inclusive, as lawmakers attempt to keep pace with an innovation-driven culture that they are attempting to cultivate.
So what we explored were 3 different communities navigating the complex DIY landscape. The communities that we investigated were post-industrial towns, anarchists, and maker communities.
We thought it would be interesting to explore how anarchists may respond within a UK in which DIY bio becomes more prevalent. Anarchist subcultures often address social injustices through using advanced, available technologies to mobilize and hack in ways that often challenge the efforts of governments and firms. London is a city that has been affected by a housing crisis that has escalated over the course of the last decade. Symptoms of this crisis include gentrification, right through to wealthy investors buying vast amounts of property as a commodity that sit empty, whilst many people are outpriced of their own neighborhoods. Within our present day, anarchists have responded to this culture through occupying some of these properties, and in rare cases engaging in architectural sabotage. Anarchists may begin to take inspiration from invasive organisms such as Japanese knotweed, organisms that thrive within certain environments, spreading and occupying property and shifting value. Anarchists will begin to design their own invasive organisms. Within the UK 2029, one such group has continued to inject genetically modified fungi into brickwork within gentrified areas of East and South London, previously injected with unwanted investment. The organisms are designed to grow through the walls and release airborne non-toxic hallucinogenic particles that often pass through into buildings' interiors. These invasive fungi are developed through expressing known pathways for non-toxic hallucinogens such as salvinorin A within spore-releasing filamentous fungi. Brickwork would provide great environments for the fungi to grow through and would become difficult to remove once they had begun to occupy the architecture. However, it may be that other compounds and chassis are experimented with. Metabolic pathways for compounds such as salvinorin A are currently known, yet those for other compounds such as LSD are not. However, the study of such currently restricted compounds could be taken up by private crowd scientist groups, experimenting through trial and error within their own homes and sharing their results within encrypted digital repositories. Equally, spore-releasing bacteria may be a more invasive chassis as a toolkit for disrupting gentrification expands.
Our next speculative case study investigates the changing relationships citizens could have to historical contamination in their environment and questions the ethics of the deployment of gene drives. No politician has ever divided public opinion more than Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister from 1979 until 1990. She controversially oversaw the dismantling of much of the UK's heavy industry, leaving the communities previously dependent on them without a source of income and without option for retraining. These communities still feel intense emotions towards these decisions made in the past, which was seen when Margaret Thatcher died in 2013, when they organised celebrations on her funeral day where they burnt effigies of her in the streets. However, what we found most interesting were the young people who joined in these celebrations, many of whom weren't even born during her time as Prime Minister. This illustrated to us that in certain social environments, political beliefs and political struggles can be inherited through the generations, much like DNA. The impact of political decisions are also recorded in the environment. Our story is set in Sheffield, where today the heavy metal contamination of the area's former steel industry remains in the soil, damaging the health of the communities who once relied on this industry. In our future, a researcher fed up with the continuing lack of action to remediate post-industrial areas such as Sheffield deploys an unregulated gene drive as a protest. This gene drive is designed to modify the existing population of wildflowers to become biosensors for heavy metal contaminants. This is achieved by adding a genetic switch into their genome, which floods their petals with M-turquoise chromoproteins when they grow in an environment containing high concentrations of heavy metals. By releasing this as a gene drive, the biosensors become integrated into the landscape itself, continuously sensing and communicating whether there are toxins in the environment, providing communities with an emotive signal that they can use to apply pressure to government bodies to tackle these issues. Gene drives implement additional elements of CRISPR to desired genetic modification so that it is inherited by all offspring of the modified organism, regardless of whether it mates with another modified organism or its wild-type counterpart. The transgene is engineered to replicate itself from one chromosome to the other, so that sexual reproduction always results in a homozygous offspring expressing the transgene. In theory, this means that genetic modification could spread to affect all members of an existing population of an organism. This is inherently controversial, as it effectively circumvents natural selection, which many people see as nature's last defense system against human intervention.
So this is our last case study, biosecurity. An interesting aspect is the fact that, that it is increasingly more easy working with synthetic biology these days, making it possible for everyone to engage with this growing technology. Within this realm, promises are made about an unknown future in which synthetic biology comes to be a public good. Our generation is becoming more and more aware of how easy it is to shape their own world without having to rely on products and services created by for the majority. Products and services that speak to one and the same need that companies assume a lot of users are coping with. Take, for example, the article that we put up on the slide. These kids recreated an HIV drug which had previously had its price raised by its patent holder. Imagine if the metabolic pathway for this drug or similar patented compounds could be engineered into a microbe. This would significantly challenge companies' ability to restrict the public's access to it. Because when using a microorganism, you have a self-replicating factory. Patenting a gene or a GMO is something that has been around for helping scientists to research and produce and to serve drugs to serve the society. Nevertheless, there is a big downside to patent rules regarding to our fast changing and moving society. One in which patent trolls play a big role, running to buy patents without using but keeping to sell for a high price. The structure of DNA becomes property. Is this land grabbing or genuine value adding? That is a question. How will the society that is open to experiment and creating with biology respond to this fact, and they are held back from certain possibilities to grow, and how will the government that already stated to encourage this type of innovation respond? Within our future, we foresee DIY bioengineers to respond to this closed patent legislations by protecting and securing the GMO newborns. Because of the increased presence of patent trolls looking to exploit peer-to-peer DIY innovations, people are beginning to experiment with radical methods of protecting and concealing their creation from being stolen or taken from them. One such procedure involves embedding tiny implant pouches within the skin to temporarily store the microbial factories via a needle transfer. Appearing as a pimple-like sites within the skin, the implant maintains their creations at perfect temperature for survival whilst protecting the person from infection. You can contain the bacteria within the implant without being able to leak or interact with other bacteria. Some of the products have a harmful effect on the skin. Therefore, it is stored in a silicone implant because it could actually contain harmful chemicals for our skin.
To conclude our presentation, I'd just like to reiterate what we're trying to explore with this project. We're interested in the way that DIY biology could serve functions that aren't industrial and how they could empower citizen scientists to challenge social injustices that they encounter in everyday life. Organisms can be designed for political or social reasons rather than their physical capabilities. Here's our website with more information, and we would like to thank our tutors, Naomi, Larissa, and Sweet Eric. We love you. He carried some of our glass domes for the exhibition through. And everyone else who's helped us with this vastly complicated project. We'd like to open up for questions.
Thank you so much, University of Edinburgh. Questions from our judges. Woo. Hold on, I'll be right back.
It's clear that you've done a bunch of social science and philosophy thinking in addition to the science thinking you did here. And I wonder if you'd like to point to some text or some things you were reading that you found inspirational in this area.
think about that, actually.
I think we were really sort of conscious of the sort of dominant overarching narrative that biotechnology will change, like will save the world. And then when we look at the current legislation and what's actually happening, it's not happening. So we were sort of seeing this discrepancy between these green papers being issued by the UK government and the promise that competitions like biodesign are sort of promising the world. And we're trying to see how that gap maybe could be messier and more socially conscious. So I hope that answers the question.
I wanted to thank you so much for acknowledging and accounting for power structures, social inequalities, and those sorts of vulnerabilities. I feel like those things have been sort of conspicuously absent from a lot of the projects here, so I appreciate that very much. I'm wondering if you could maybe speculate about the idea of citizen science is being used by big science in a lot of ways to sort of either distribute labor, right, to the citizens in this sort of seemingly democratic way, but it's really about data collection and not so much anarchistic aims. So I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts about the sort of co-opting of citizen science by existing structures?
I might be avoiding an answer to this, but you're talking about data collecting and using people in that way. And a lot of the way through the project, we kind of ended up with analogies between this emerging industry of synthetic biology, but then looking at the digital world as well and emerging technologies within that and how they began and how they've had a head start on synthetic biology. And now with machine learning and all these technologies, we're seeing what we thought was data collection to be quite exploitative. And so I suppose that all these projects were kind of responding to that future situation where at the moment, a lot of this stuff would not need to be addressed. But yeah, I might be avoiding the question. Apologies.
Hi. I've got a question for you guys. First of all, it's great to see Edinburgh finally has a community biolab. They certainly didn't when I was there. I love the idea of the gene drive protest, although I'm pretty sure my colleagues Kenoi and Kevin Esveld won't. I've got a question about the Frankenflowers project. So you guys came up with this idea that you've got this gene drive, unauthorized gene drive release that changes poppies in Europe to sense heavy metals. That, I mean, unregulated and released, that project still seems like quite a good idea. Did you contemplate doing something that would be a bit more nefarious than that? And if you did, why didn't you talk about that today?
I think that a lot of conversations about DIY bio are either very utopian or very dystopian, and we wanted to find that middle ground where people are pursuing goals which are believable and understandable and that we can empathize with. So having something that isn't particularly nefarious but is probably on the edge of, is this okay, is more effective in sort of communicating that middle ground where the vast majority of the public will be thinking and is like, in many ways, I'm more scared of what big corporations will be doing with this technology than what people will be doing with it in their lab at home. So we wanted to find that grey space, and we wanted to find that those understandable reasons why people would want to do this.
Last question. So just touching off of what you just said, I love this project. It's fantastic. I think that's the really interesting thing about this is I think more than anyone else, you've really hit on that dual use category and sort of exploited it and played around with it. And I hope that this will, I don't really have a question as much as a comment, that I really hope a project like this has a life after Biodesign Challenge. And one of the things that's great about Biodesign Challenge is that it does offer a space for us to have these kinds of debates and discussions and poke at, dual use and poke at ethics and start putting those conversations not just in the corporations and the science and technologists, but also bring art and design into the conversation. I think this project's really succeeded at that in a wonderful way. But I really hope that it, something like this being involved in a policy conversation, like a real serious policy conversation, would be really useful. And so I hope you have plans for where you're going to take this next as a piece. Yeah.
We were initially, we were wanting to really make film, moving image around it, because with our exhibition piece, we felt that, it was very hard to communicate these timelines and moving time and through these artifacts when it could be shown in a much more effective way. So that would be what we'd love to do, but also have a form for communication. Yes.
Yeah. You can contact us through our website. and if you would like to fund a sort of speculative documentary.
Yes. Thank you so much.